Welcome to this bonus episode of the Connexus podcast. And we're talking today with Sarah Joy Covey. And I just want to introduce her to you before she joins us. She leads and collaborates with a highly qualified team at the Covey Wellness Center, which is local to Connexus in Central Ontario. She's a registered psychotherapist, and she walks with clients through all kinds of relational and spiritual and mental health issues. And one of her passions is to train and teach new therapists. And she does that with her team here locally so that she can build a team that people can trust and care and reach out to the Covey Wellness Center for help. Specifically, she's keen to support those of us who are interested in the intersection of psychology and Christian spirituality. And she provides support for spiritual growth and connection. She speaks widely. She has workshops. She has a podcast, Covey Wellness Center podcast. And man, if you've been following us with this series, The Spiritual Side of Mental Health When You're Not Okay, you know she's a perfect fit to have a conversation with. So, Sarah, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here with you today, Jeff. That's great.
Yeah, we're really glad that you're here. We're going to jump right in. And we're talking a little bit in the final week of the series. I'm talking about trauma. And so I want to kind of jump in that word. And we were talking before we started, it can be a bit of a loaded word these days, trauma, trauma-informed, you hear all of these terms. So the word trauma, it's been more commonly used. Talk to me about what the word trauma means. Is it like a major event in someone's life, like a divorce or a car accident? Is it more complex than that? Does everyone experience trauma? Just talk about the word a little bit before we get started.
I think it's a great place to start because a lot of people have ideas about what trauma is, and sometimes, ideas about their own experiences and either disqualifying or qualifying them as trauma or not because they don't really understand what we're talking about. And so in the simplest terms, the way I like to describe this is that anything that we experience that impairs our nervous system from functioning optimally is really trauma. Right. And so it takes us outside of that optimal zone. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, too. But there's this sense in which we've gone outside of our capacity to respond optimally because of any number of things. So that could be something as simple as something someone said to you in high school. That could be a car accident. That could be witnessing something. That could be listening to somebody else's story about being traumatized. You can get vicarious trauma. There's all kinds of complex trauma, which is combinations of times that your system has been impaired. And so really under that umbrella, it's kind of like we just get taken out of our safety zone, right? And into our tolerable zone to more of a survival zone. So our body kicks in and our systems kick in and say, okay, I got to just stay alive here. What's it going to take to keep me alive here? And again, depending on the intensity of the trauma or the type of trauma, there can be varying degrees of that. And some people can have trauma and recover from that very quickly, right? Because they have the ability to resolve and sort of complete the loop, right? To return their body to safety. But sometimes that's not the case. And so I know you and I both love Andy Kolber's book, Try Softer, which I think is one of the best resources out there, really practical, accessible language around trauma and some great exercises for people. It's one that we keep here at the center all the time in the bookstore because I recommend it so much across the boards. And she talks about that big T and little t trauma concept. And so and just the difference between how things can become impaired, but nevertheless be impaired. So the way I like to describe this is if you imagined that my nervous system is represented by my left hand, okay? And if someone took a hammer and smashed my left hand and broke all the bones in it and just demolished it, that would be traumatic, right? That would be an impairment of my hand's ability to function optimally. And so we know those things are trauma. We tend to be able to identify those big T traumas, right? The car accident, the death of a loved one, the witnessing something heinous or just something that's going to overwhelm you visually to see, even if you haven't participated in it, like children in a home where there's abuse or things like that happening. So that hammer that whacks the hand, obviously that hand is impaired. And we can kind of understand that. And those single blows, I would call those big T trauma. Mm-hmm. But then we also have in our lives things that accumulate more like paper cuts. So what happens there is the same hand, if you can imagine, starts to get like has a paper cut. Well, sometimes there's enough time for that paper cut to heal. And so that trauma is resolved and it doesn't stay with us. But if you have paper cuts that keep coming before the previous paper cut is healed, you can keep getting paper cuts in that hand. And you can just imagine over time that cumulative effect, paper cut after paper cut, not enough time to heal, not healing. That hand is still going to be impaired. You still can't use your left hand, even though it's not smashed to smithereens by a hammer. Right. You still are fully impaired from using that hand optimally. And of course, there's combinations in everyone's life of big T and little t trauma. So maybe you have a few times that your hand's been smashed, but you also have a lot of paper cut trauma. Or maybe you have a lot of little t trauma and not very much big T. Or maybe you have a whole bunch of big T. Either way, you're going to experience the same outcome neurobiologically and in your nervous system. Your ability to manage and to regulate is going to be impaired by those traumas. So, they take us out of our regular capacity to manage stress. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And it sounds like, that if you have a combination of little T traumas, they could happen close together. They could happen over like an extended time in your life. Is that right? That's what it sounds like.
That's right. Absolutely. So everybody has their own sort of complex trauma in the sense of, when their experiences happen to them. They might have had a home life that just had a really antagonistic parent. And so the criticism or the contempt towards them was just coming at them with paper cut trauma day in, day out, day in, day out. Well, again, that's going to create a similar kind of result in the system as maybe somebody might experience through something that's more of a big T trauma in a more immediate way, right? So there's always this combination. So everybody has their own individual story that needs to be unpacked to understand what their nervous system's responding to, how they find themselves, where they find themselves related to this. But there is, in that definition, everyone experiences trauma. Like there isn't anybody who doesn't have times that have impaired their system from functioning optimally. Lots of people are in settings where they are able to repair and go back to restoring their system. And that's a factor too with healing trauma. Are you in a home that allows you to self-regulate again, to find safety in the body, to move through that experience? Or are you in a situation where maybe you don't have the skills or the coping to return your body to safety? And so then it just accumulates in the system.
Right. You can see why it's important to process it with a professional if you can, because, you can give general principles, but everybody's experience is going to be different. That's everybody's going to have a different experience.
And people can go through the same experience. So 4 people could be in the same car in a car accident and experience trauma. They were all in the same trauma, but they all have a different experience of that trauma. And so I can't just say, well, the treatment plan for the driver is the same as the passenger, is the same as the 2 guys in the back seat. They have their own experience. Maybe somebody else was in a traumatic car accident before, and that's highly triggering for them. Maybe the person in the back didn't even know what happened. It was barely affected. So it's not a one size fits all. It's very nuanced. And so, we want to be careful of those generalities, and we want to have really good conversations with clients about, their particular set of circumstances. And we use tools like evaluating like adverse childhood events and things like that to determine kind of what their framework is, how much trauma they have experienced and how that's impacting them.
That's great. Okay. Really helpful. Now we're talking about the spiritual side of mental health, and the church, unfortunately, has been a part of a lot of trauma that's happened in people's lives as well. The church is made up of human beings who are broken and sinful, who are trying to figure out life together. And unfortunately, there's some really great things that the church has done and some really damaging things the church has done. And we're not going to be able to go into a lot of detail on all of those, but I think,
right.
From abuse to the way things have been presented in ways that are hurtful, manipulation, just something that comes with the sinful side of human beings, and really unfortunate. If you're listening to this and that's you, I'm just really sorry that's been a part of your experience as a church leader. I do want to say that. Just so that that we do hurt for you, and I'm sorry that's happened to you at the hands of a church. And I want to talk a little bit about that. And I kind of want to start with as it relates to kind of recovery and the gospel, the hope of Jesus. There can tend to be in some of our lives this sense of you got to earn love from God. You got to try harder to get your life right. Where's the church kind of gone wrong here on this?
Well, I think in some cases the church has meshed with the culture to say that performance is, your way through. So like you mentioned, that try harder. The book we talked about before is Try Softer. And that's the message in direct opposition to sort of that cultural norm of if I could just do more things, if I can just muscle through, if I can just push myself harder or do more, that's going to be the answer. And of course, that's not how Christ comes to us. Christ comes to us with grace. It's that age-old question, is it grace or works? Well, Jesus says, it's not what you're doing. It's not what you're doing or not doing that makes me love you. My love is there. It's unconditional and it's an invitation. I mean, I love what you've been saying in this series around your mental health is an invitation to your spiritual life. Right. And I think that's just it, right? We're coming in our brokenness, in our mess, it's very messy in everybody's world, coming in that mess to something that says you're already accepted in your mess. You don't have to prove your worthiness. But that's not how we feel in the culture. We're all coming up against, hustle culture and performance and productivity. And you and I both recognize this in our personality structures too, right? We got to strive more. We got to be more. We got to prove our worth. And if that's not the answer, we're almost merging that with the church messaging instead of realizing, oh, wait, the church is the answer to that longing in my heart to not have to strive, right? To not have to try harder, right? That gentleness, soothing, kindness, self-compassion, that's the pathway to healing. And the church is answering that as a countercultural norm. Right? Or should be, right? That's what we want to give. That message we want to give to people is their grace is sufficient for you. Come to me, all who are weary, and I'll give you rest. That's not a message that the culture is giving us at all.
Right. That makes total sense to me. So in light of that and kind of where the church is at today, and I understand, I don't want to put you on the spot as you are the expert to speak to the whole Western church, but I would love to kind of get your opinion. If you were to nudge or point the Western church in a direction when it comes to causing trauma, walking with people who've experienced trauma, what would you say?
Well, I appreciate you saying that because I feel, again, this is a whole probably series of conversations of things, and lots of people are doing a great job in asking these questions and having conversation. And so I actually went to my team with this question.
Oh, great.
To kind of talk to them, because a number of them have, particularly those on my team who are offering faith-based counseling, a lot of them are pastors or ministry leaders for years and years, and this is a second career for them. So I wanted to get their insight on this from being inside the ministry. And then I have my own thoughts as well. So I'm actually going to refer to some notes so that I can represent them. So it's not just me, it's my team that I'm bringing forward. But one of the things they really appreciated was the humility in even asking those questions. Right. So one of my therapists, she said, it shows a willingness to learn and to change and to seek to understand if you're even going to ask a question about where a nudge needs to happen. And that was just really encouraging to my team that yourself, Jeff, but Connexus as well is wading into this territory and and thinking about it and saying, we can learn here, we can grow here, and we're open to that. And I think that heart is something that we would say for the whole church, the church globally. Do we have a heart of humility? Do we have a desire to understand? Another thing that came forward, and I jokingly called this the "with great power comes great responsibility,"
right?
Peter Parker. But there is a lot of power differentials in church. Like, we have a lot of people in positions of influence, in positions of responsibility over minors or over the spiritual care of someone. And so we have to hold that with a different level of discernment, because we also have a greater impact for harm. Right? Like, so the greater that power differential, the greater the impact for harm.
That's
and
good.
So, we have to really be mindful of that and take that responsibility really seriously, and be wise about boundaries, be wise about, interactions with people, be wise about our words, and be thoughtful and discerning. I think we sometimes forget that we hold a lot of that power, even if we don't want to. Like, sometimes as leaders, we're like, well, I don't really want that. I don't want to have that kind of power, but we do, right? Because we're in positions of influence. And so to be mindful of that. Something else that came up along those lines is like kind of knowing your lane. So sometimes therapists can get really frustrated with all sorts of professions, not just churches. I know I experienced this in teaching, in my background too, where teachers want to step in and be the mental health professional, because they have these relationships with kids. I was a teacher who had those relationships with kids, and I had to know, in our field, we call it our boundaries of competence. Right? Where are those boundaries where, okay, this is outside of my wheelhouse. This is a professional needs to come in here. Like, I can listen, I can be supportive, but I can't be the counselor or the psychotherapist in this scenario. I need to refer this person to a doctor, and vice versa. Even doctors sometimes, can be frustrating to psychotherapists. And I'm sure it's the same the other way, because they'll say things to clients, and the clients come to us and we're like, no, like, that's not it. But then we have to have this grace for each other of like, we're all trained in our own lanes and we don't know the other lanes, and we have some awareness of that. And that's important to learn, but also we need to know where, okay, like, this part is mine to do in my field, and this part is mine to do. And we can really collaborate well, I think, under that heading.
That's a good word. Before you go to the next one, I think that's a good word for any of us who've been in counseling. Like, I've been in counseling. That doesn't mean I'm a counselor. I think about when I used to be a high school teacher, and
me too.
People would have advice for me as a high school teacher because they went to high school. Well, it's not the same to be like a student and a teacher. Are two very, very different experiences. And I think any of us can get trapped into like, well, I went to counseling and this was my experience, so I'm diagnosing you as having the same challenges I was having. You know?
And I think there's a huge importance in like sharing our stories of going to counseling, because I think that's something that's changing. And I'm so excited about it, because people will just say, well, my counselor said this, or my therapist said this in regular conversation. I think, oh, well, that's normalizing going to counseling. And I think that's super important. But there is a difference between talking to your friend and talking to a counselor. It's not the same thing. And if you think it's the same thing, it's probably because you haven't done counseling, because you're equating that as the same modality as counseling. And so just recognizing in that space for all of us, where our skills lend to us, and then coordinating well and redirecting. If someone has spiritual or theological questions, that's not mine to answer.
Right.
I want to redirect them to their faith leaders. Right.
Right. That's great. You had one more? You had one more, so I don't want to cut you off.
I have a couple more, if that's okay.
Go for it.
Yeah. So another one was the concept of embodiment. This was the one that was big for me. Is I think there's a real challenge in the church around separating flesh and spirit, and misconstruing that in a way that kind of differentiates us from the fact that God created our bodies, and in the ways that they respond to the world and in all of the facets of that. And I think sometimes we can be really cognitive in the church and forget that our bodies are part of how we live in the world because God made it that way. And so really, recognizing the physical aspects of things like trauma in the body, and not being too cerebral about it or not dismissive of those kinds of reactions. And then I guess the other thing I would say is sort of this sense of like making space. And I think you did this really well in your first service where you went and sat down with the congregation and said, look, like we're in this together. We're going to just make some space to reflect. And I think a lot of times churches will not make space for the mess. It's messy. And people need to lament. That's not a familiar word. That's another thing we talked about actually in the group too, was just translating the language and, finding those intersection points with some of the language of psychology and the language of Christianity and showing how like these don't have to be, mutually exclusive. And laments may be one of those words that we use in like a Christian culture, but really it's just, can people bring their honest sadness, their sorrow? Can there be space in churches? Like we say it's a hospital for the sick, but we mostly show up all shiny and polished and protective and guarded. And it all looks happy. And most people are not living in those realities, at least not consistently. And so can we make a space where those struggles can come and be known and be seen and be validated and not feel like they're outside of the shiny, happy people vibe, Right.
Yeah. And some of people's, it's so key. I think I'm glad you brought that up because I think it's so critical for me as a church leader. And for those, who are Christians in our church, sometimes if we've grown up as Christians, we've been brought up in a culture of like, you just leave all of that leave your mess at the door, come in shiny, go home. And we're not being loving to ourselves when we do it to ourselves, but we're definitely not being loving to other people when we put the expectation on them. And you start to repeat a culture that's not healthy. So I appreciate you bringing that up. I would love to talk about the past because this is one of the things I hear. I'm a future-oriented person. I totally get it. People say, I don't want to go back in my past. I don't want to talk about, when I was a kid. Like I just want to look ahead and leave it behind. But I know when it comes to trauma, sometimes, looking at the earliest relationships, I've heard can be helpful. So why is that? Talk to me about the value in some senses of looking to your past rather than just kind of putting your head down and moving into the future.
Barreling forward. Well, generally, I would say that you look to the past because it's affecting your present and it's going to carry forward into the future if you don't deal with it. So we think we're compartmentalizing it, but you're actually being affected in your life right now by things that happened in your past. So you need to be able to understand that if you don't want to keep carrying those patterns forward. By all means, if you want to keep carrying those patterns forward, you don't need to look back. Just keep going. And in some cases, when they're positive patterns, that's true, right? We don't need to correct them. That solid work ethic is serving me well. And that's something I learned. And I'm not going to examine it unless it's causing me, stress or workaholism or the things that could turn into. But if it's in check, then I do want to carry that forward. And that's a pattern from my childhood or messaging from my parents or my family culture. But there are some things that are affecting us in the present that are just barriers for us. And that can relate to some trauma responses. That can relate to just our remember when we talked about when people are traumatized, our ability to restore safety to the body in response to some of those things. If we haven't really completed those loops and done some healing, it's going to keep cropping up in the form of triggers or behaviors, and we don't fully understand why we're doing them. And if we don't look to find that understanding and make meaning and make sense of things, which is like a huge need for us psychologically. When people say, I don't understand why I'm doing this, or why doesn't everybody think this way? Or why do I keep making the same mistake? the longing there is to understand and to be able to make meaning of what's happening in our lives. And that making sense sort of desire cognitively helps to then find other pathways forward. And so I certainly think that's true. And then we can go to, broad strokes. We won't get into these in detail, but we know there's a ton of work around attachment theory, which just talks about how those early years really form us in different ways, very particular ways. And so if we don't understand those early childhood connections, we may not understand how those things are still impacting us in our relationships now. We also, I know you guys talk about the Enneagram a lot at Connexus. Mm-hmm. And so if we look at things like the nature nurture component of why we are where we are. So our nature tends to be our personality, our temperament, but the nurture component of that, the context in which we were raised and the way we developed into adults, our lived experiences through, childhood and beyond will often dictate the degree of health in which we're showing up in our personality. So even though we have these traits, we might be really struggling. So for me as an Enneagram 1, I might be really struggling with perfectionism if, for example, that was something that was also reinforced in my family culture. You have to do everything perfectly. You get 98% on a test, and where's the other 2%, mm-hmm. right? You just have to keeping up, not just with that bent in my personality, but in the lived experience of my family culture. And that's now shaping maybe how I'm moving forward in the world. So we have to tease out those components to really have an appropriate understanding. And that's what helps us give the pathway forward. So that's the investment. The going back is actually an investment in the future. And I just will make the caveat with trauma work. The most important part of trauma work initially is recreating safety and emotional regulation in the body. So if you're going to work with somebody on trauma and they're instantly taking you back or telling your story, they are not trauma informed.
Right.
You cannot go immediately into not a deep dive. You can broad strokes, history, but you don't want to go into a deep dive until you know that you have created safety and an ability to have tools to bring their system back into alignment and into safety. And so we do want to go back, but the caveat, of course, is that you're doing that in a safe way, right. That's not going to re-trigger or re-traumatize you, which is, again, going back to why it's so important to be with a professional who understands that.
Because I would think a common fear would be, I don't know if I want to do this, because what if I go back and I find out something I don't want to find out? Or what if I go back, I think that's a pretty common fear for people is totally. Sometimes it's not what I do know. Sometimes it's what what do I not know that I'm going to remember? Yeah. Could you speak to that for a moment?
Well, the first thing I want to say to that person is just tell that to your therapist. We work here at Covey Wellness Center on therapist-informed or feedback-informed practice. And what we mean by that is, even if we're not soliciting feedback from you throughout the process, we want that to be, we talk about people being in the driver's seat. We're in the passenger seat. You're deciding how fast we're going. You're deciding what trip we're taking, what detour we're taking, whether we stop for snacks. You're in the driver's seat. So if you are worried about that, then just bring that forward in the first session. Mm-hmm. Say, look, this is a concern for me, because your therapist, if it's a good therapist, they should say, absolutely, we're taking this at your pace. We're not going to push you, beyond any capacity that you have to be resilient. This is about your healing. It's not about making it harder for you. And that's not to say that it won't be hard work. You and I have both done therapy work ourselves, and it is hard, but you do it in a container where it's done safely with support and with kindness and encouragement and timing and pacing that works for you. There should never be a time when a therapist is pushing people into recalling or spaces beyond the agency of the person in therapy. They should always feel in control. And because think about trauma. A lot of times we're traumatized because we're out of control. So how would that be helpful in therapy if people came to therapy and felt like the therapist was now controlling it? The whole point is to empower them, to give them back agency And so just work with your therapist on that, and don't be afraid to say, this is too much. I don't want to go there. And your therapist absolutely should be respecting those boundaries.
Yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
And if you're looking for someone who's been through something similar, I've said to a therapist before, I don't want to be here. So it's like, I don't want to be here, but I don't have a choice. And so here's where I am. So yeah, I love that. Be honest. Now, I talked a little bit about a very simplistic version of Dan Siegel's window of tolerance in one of my as simple as I could kind of break it down. I would love for you to talk a little bit about the window of tolerance, how it works, how people can leverage it.
Yeah. So again, we're going to go a bit high level, but we can get, when you're working with somebody, you can get into the specifics of what your individual needs are in managing your own window of tolerance. But essentially, just like we were talking about before, living within, if you imagine a window that can open or shut, right? And so you have this much space or you have this much space, there's this sense in which when we're living optimally, our window of tolerance allows fluctuation within the window that's open, right, to allow us to live in a balanced, safe way in the world. And when you have traumatic experiences, they can often close that window. They can make it smaller. So we have less room to kind of move in that optimal space. And the good news is those things can be changed. Our capacity can be expanded, but we have to understand what's needed to do that. Because a lot of people will find, like, if we think about triggers or like tipping points, people will find often with a small window of tolerance because of trauma in the background or a great degree of stress, they're overreacting or very quickly. Right. So one thing I like to give to my clients around this is to think about in what I call them, DRRs. So disproportionate recurring reactions. So you'll notice a little bit about your window of tolerance based on when you have a reaction that's not proportional to the stimulus.
That's good.
So the example I give about this is if I'm in the kitchen in the morning getting ready for work and I drop my mug on the floor with my tea in it, because I'm a tea drinker, and it smashes everywhere to smithereens. If I'm instantly in a rage, flying off the handle, swearing, losing my mind, or I fall into a puddle on the ground and I'm paralyzed, I can't move, I'm weeping, that's a disproportionate reaction to what's happened. So maybe it's reasonable to have a level 2 out of 10 irritation, with your mug dropping on the ground, right, in the morning, and you're trying to get to work. Like there's some measure of emotional response to that that's warranted, that's proportional. But when we're going from a 2 to a 10, then our window of tolerance is probably really low. And we want to try and understand why. What took me from a 2 to a 10? Well, maybe I'm already running 20 minutes late and I'm just at a high hyper aroused state. Maybe that was my favorite mug that my friend made me, who I never see anymore. And it just opened up all this grief for me because it fell. Maybe I'm worried because I have a bunch of little kids who are now going to get hurt, and I'm hyper vigilant about the glass that's, the ceramic that's on the ground. Like there's so many factors that are taking me to that overreaction or almost that underreaction. And that's sort of that window of tolerance, right? So we have this sort of like hyper arousal that goes to like, I can't calm down. I'm just like, I'm ramped up, and we see that. I worked with a student one time in learning program support in Kingston ages ago, and he'd say like, my nerves, I can feel them, my nerves. That's what he used to say. And that's hyper arousal. Like you just feel like you can't calm down. Your prefrontal cortex, you can't find your keys because you can't think, right? Because your prefrontal cortex is disconnected, and you're angry, irritable, restless, agitated. It's when people are tapping or pacing, right? Our body just takes over, and you're in this hyper arousal. So to increase your tolerance, if that's the reaction you're getting, you want to do things that are calming and soothing. You want to do some deep breathing. Get
back in the window, whatever window you have.
Get back in the window. Do that through some sensory grounding, right? Like getting yourself into the present moment and out of that agitation. There's so many tools I could go into around that, but really it's calming and soothing, recreating safety for the body in that way. And then the opposite is the hypoarousal, which is the shutting down, the withdrawing, the disconnecting, the dissociating. The sadness, the depression, I need to I'm out, I'm paralyzed, I'm done. So you have to actually get more active in that situation to get back into the window, right? Because you need to stimulate the senses. Maybe you need to go for a walk or dance or move your body somehow, have a cold shower, or get things rolling again in your system to get you out of that hypoarousal. So either way, you're kind of bringing yourself back into that range, and you can build a plan for doing that with your counselor, based on your particular needs and how you're seeing them showing up. But it can be helpful as a measure of am I struggling with this? To think about that rating scale.
Right.
Did I just get to a 10 because I dropped my mug and that's about a 2? That's a 2. I got to figure out what took me from 2 to 10. And there's a lot of things that could be in that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's great. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I have one more question that's really helpful in this. If you have a 2 to 10 jump or it might be a under, you might not feel anything. You might be totally numb.
Right.
It's like a negative, 6 response. That's its own information too. And so what you want to think about is, in that response, how much of that response is remembered? Meaning maybe my body is saying this feels like that. There's a part of this that's saying this feels like that. It's perceived. So how am I telling myself the story about what's happening? What are my cognitions? How am I making sense of this? And how is that contributing to my reaction? And how much of it is actually proportional to or true? All of that is real. You experience all of those trauma triggers. That's a real thing in the body. It's not like you don't experience that agitation or anger or sadness, but how much of it is about this thing and how much of it is about that perception or that remembered piece. And again, those are just ways to tease out, for yourself and often with the help of a therapist to make sense of all those factors.
So when I deal with anxiety, so and I can go either way, hyper or hypo, depending on where I'm at. But in particular on the hyper front, I feel it kind of in my body. So I'll feel like tightness in my chest, and there are a few tools that kind of go, oh, it's an early sign to me that, oh, you're headed outside the window. Yeah. Are there just talk to me about that. I'm not a professional, so I don't know how that works, but is that helpful to everybody? Paying attention to your body? What are the kind of things people should be looking for? Is that just an anxiety thing? What's the role of the body when it comes to figuring out where you're at?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we use the Enneagram framework. And so I'll go back to that because I think there's a concept within that helps us think about this. So the Enneagram says that there are 3 centers of intelligence, right? So one is this body, gut, instinctual center. One is our emotion center, and one is our cognitive mind center. So body, mind, and heart, right? Mm-hmm. Which we all kind of understand. We're that's what makes us up. And the understanding there is that there's wisdom or intel, if you will, from each of those centers that we receive. And so if we can tap into those, we tend to, in our different personalities, sort of be dominant in one center. But if we can tap into all those and listen to the intel that we're getting, then we can make better sense of what's happening and find our pathways forward. Because sometimes we're all instinct barrel ahead and we're not listening to our feelings or emotions. And so when we think about body wisdom, it's there are things that our bodies are telling us, right? We can notice those things. And I sometimes call them self-care slide markers, these red flags that pop up, sometimes pink flags if they're not quite red, not high alert, but they're going red. And so there's this sense in which if we know those and we say, oh, wait a second, my shoulders are like this, and we can do that in a given day. It's okay, if I can notice that, then I can attend to that. And there's information in what my body did there about how stressed I'm feeling today. Mm-hmm. And I've had my husband say to me, Sarah, take your shoulders down from your ears. And I didn't even know because I wasn't paying attention to my body. right? So the more we can check in, the more we can attend to what we're noticing and release some of that tension that was building. If we do that, if we're somebody who has that tendency to have that, if we do that, every hour or so, just release the tension out of our shoulders, we're going to bring ourselves right back into that window of tolerance. But if I do this all day, then by the end of the day, I might not have any tolerance left for the thing my kid says to me when I arrive home.
Right.
And
right.
It's putting me into a disproportionate reaction. So there's a lot to be said for, it's amazing to me. And I was a person, so I'm just going to say straight up, I was a person for most of my teaching career who did not pay attention to my body.
Right.
I could not go to the bathroom. I could not eat lunch. I could not drink water. I just kept pushing my body through and expecting it to do what it needed to do. And I did not listen to it, even though it gave me clues like headaches. I just pop an Advil, keep going. Oh, I got a fatigue cue or a hunger cue. Okay, well, scarf down a banana and drink a Diet Coke. Keep going. Right. So there's a lot that we have dismissed. And I think there's a lot to be said for learning how to reconnect with our bodies, because that's where we can establish the safety, right, is in our bodies. And a lot of the tools involve engaging our physical bodies to feel like we're safe again. Mm-hmm. And so then our brains can come back online and all of the pieces with that. So yeah, absolutely. It's can sound like kind of out there to be like your body wisdom, but there's a lot to be said for that. I believe God created our bodies to give us these cues for our nourishment. Even if we just think about sleep and hunger alone, it tells us what we need. So it can tell us a lot more than that if we can learn to understand, what does this mean? What does that tightness in my chest mean? What does it mean when my stomach starts churning or my toe starts tapping or my eye starts twitching? And
the earlier the clues are, the better,
right,
because it just compounds over time. So that makes sense to me. Talk to me about boundaries. So boundaries, limits. We hear about this all the time. I actually think, there are some basics here that most people get. Like, I only have 24 hours a day and I should be careful with my time. Like, that's kind of pretty basic. Sure. But like, what? And so instead of saying like, hey, give me the top 10 tips for boundaries, I thought I'd ask, like, what do people miss? Like, when you talk to people about this, like, what is it like? Most people just don't think of this or don't catch this.
Well, the first thing that came to mind is that I think people see boundaries or limits as somehow like restrictive or punitive, kind of like diets or budgets, right?
Right.
Where they have this negative connotations like boundaries. It's like, oh, or my limits. If I have to live within my limits or exercise boundaries, like somehow like I can't live the fullness of life. And I think the secret is that, in fact, we live well and sustainably and with health when we acknowledge our limitations, when we set good boundaries. That's what actually allows us that fullness of life. And so I think sometimes people miss that because they feel like, I don't want to be, I don't want to have to sleep 8 hours a night. I'm just going to get up at 4 a.m. and go to bed at 12 and I can just push through and do that. Well, I'll see you in a few years if you do that, but it's not going to work for you because those limitations are there to serve optimal living. And if you push those boundaries from what is healthy for you, there will be a cost somewhere, right? And so I think that's maybe what people miss is like, what's the cost of me not having boundaries?
Right.
Not so much, oh, okay, well, I only have this much. But if I don't have them, what happens then? Right? How does that affect me? And there's an incongruence kind of component to this too. I talk about the yes-no matchup in therapy. And it's that idea that we don't realize the psychological and inner sort of turmoil that we have when we don't set boundaries because we say yes to something externally and it's a no internally. And then we cause ourselves so much distress, or the opposite, right? So we can say no externally when it's really a yes internally, And so really trying to have an understanding of like, what is it that I need related to this? Is this something I should say yes to? And wait until you're clear before you're saying a yes. Is it something I should say no to? And hold that congruence, because I'll give you a very silly example, but like, I love teenagers, but I'm not really a great kid with little babies and stuff. Like, I'm not a person you want to put in your children's ministry at those lower levels, because I'm not the nurturing person you want to like welcome and coddle a baby. Right. But there was always this pressure for me to say yes when I had little babies, because that was sort of the expectation that every mom took their turn. But it was always so much inner turmoil for me when I did that, because I was so not suited to that. And I would like lose sleep over having to do nursery the next morning, like that's not good. There's lots of places that I could serve and say yes to, teaching something or leading something or hosting a group or talking to teens about something. Those are all like, yes, like that's a matchup. But if I'm saying yes to something and it's a no, I'm just going to wrestle that down. It's just going to create all kinds of stress. Mm-hmm. So we want to know those things. And if we don't know, give yourself time to discern that. Don't say yes or no so quickly that you haven't thought it through, for that alignment. Right. So yeah, I think that's what people miss. That's what came to mind.
Really helpful. Really helpful. Okay. I know you're an Enneagram 1. And I know, I hope it's okay that I told everybody that, but
it's fine. I talk about it all the time.
Which comes often comes with the inner critic, and so a lot of people deal with that. So I would love to hear what you've learned about handling an inner critic, if that's something someone's facing.
Yeah, you know what? Again, I could talk about this a lot because it is something I wrestle with. I think, I think there's some different strategies for managing the inner critic. There's a couple of strategies I'll offer. That one is a little more common and the other one's a little more out there, but it has been helpful for some people. One is to really externalize the critic. So sometimes we hear the critic as our own voice. This is true of most Enneagram 1s. It's not always true of other numbers. It can be. We all have a certain degree of like self-correction and self-criticism. But sometimes it can also be what would be called like a ghost voice, like somebody in your life, like a parent or a teacher or a mentor. You might actually be hearing their voice, right? So sometimes it's recognizing that that's not your voice, that it is actually an echoing voice from your past that's coming in. But if you do hear it as your own voice, sometimes it can be helpful to sort of name it. So I jokingly call my inner critic Bertha. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, Bertha's at it again. Okay, Bertha, that's not I'm separating cognitively Bertha's voice from me. This is not my identity. I'm not one and the same. So Bertha is wanting to provide her feedback. That's great. And I'll take that with a grain of salt. But Bertha is not Sarah. And I'm sorry to anybody whose name is Bertha, because I'm sure there's wonderful people named Bertha out there. It's just
Bertha,
the name that
we're sure you're really nice, Bertha. We know you are.
Yeah. And if you have an inner critic, don't call it Bertha, because that's defeating the purpose. But
right.
There's these automatic thoughts. And so kind of just separating that, externalizing that voice kind of gives us some space, I've also heard a suggestion, which I loved, and I saw it in play in a behavioral experiment. I thought this is fascinating, is to sing the criticisms. So actually sing the criticisms like, you are a jerk and you shouldn't have done that, right? Like it sounds so ridiculous, but that's the whole point, is that if you sing them back to yourself, you're going to realize that this is not worthy of listening to, that criticism just kind of take the punch out of it, and it makes it kind of silly, but it distances that cognitive connection, as if this is the way forward, is to just constantly heed the critic and please the critic, right? Mm-hmm. It takes it out of that by, it's really funny. And you can you can use simple songs like Happy Birthday or whatever, doesn't matter, but put it into singing, and it'll usually take you to something that you're laughing at. You're like, this is ridiculous, right? And then the other one, which is the most common one I use, is looking at it through a lens of self-compassion, right? And so I talk about raising up the voice of that compassionate friend. So when you hear all this stuff coming in your internal dialogue and your self-talk that's highly critical, turn it around and ask yourself, what would I say to the friend that I love who is hearing this, right? If I'm outside of myself, what would I say? What would I say to Jeff Brodie if he was sharing these same things that he's thinking about himself? I wouldn't say, yeah, you're right, Jeff. You are kind of a jerk and you really messed that up. You're a dum-dum. Like, I'm not going to say any of that stuff to him. I'm going to say, that is not true at all. That's not who you are. That you have worked so hard and everybody makes mistakes, and like all these encouraging, validating, it's so clarifying, because we realize that we would never talk to ourselves the way that we would talk to someone we love, which of course is the precise problem, right? So it's bring it back to self-compassion. And I really believe that self-compassion, compassionate friend voice is the voice of God to us. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the voice we're raising up by thinking that way, right? And so you could even ask yourself, people of faith could say, what's the thing that God says to me in this? What's Jesus's voice to me in this? Is it, you're horrible, you messed up, you definitely shouldn't show your face around here anymore? Right. It's not that voice. That's not the voice of Jesus. And so, but sometimes it's hard for us to understand it until we switch that, we flip that and say, what would I say to my child who I love? What would I say to my friend who I love if they were hearing these things as if they were true? And how then can I bring it back to myself and tell myself those things? And I love Lauren Daigle's song, You Say, mm-hmm. As a anthem for people with inner criticism. I don't know if you do show notes for these, but if people don't know,
we can put it in,
link to it.
And we did it on a Sunday, actually, in the series as well. So,
oh, did you? Oh, I love it. So it's
great.
Just so powerful. And so just trying to reorient, wait a minute, like all this, Bertha's saying all these things, but that's not what God says. That's not what's true. And sort of letting that wash over you and fill your mind with that way of thinking. But yeah, it's a tough one. And sometimes we don't even realize how acclimatized we are to that negative self-talk until we start to unpack it, to actually name it, because we're so, like, for me as an Enneagram 1, especially, like, I didn't even realize how incessant it was. And when my husband found out I was an Enneagram 1 and that's how it happened, he just looked at me and he said, that must be horrible. Like, and he was on the verge of tears. And I just was like, it is horrible. Like, I didn't even know, because we have our blind spots, right? Personality or otherwise. And until someone helps us illuminate that, like, for me, that was so validating about how hard that is for me to deal with an inner critic, because he doesn't have that. And when he heard about it, he realized how hard that can be. But it is a common challenge in varying degrees. And so it's important to get our thoughts back online to something that's true, and compassionate.
And I love from a faith perspective, talking about, hey, what would Jesus say to me in the midst of this? And the kind of the last question I kind of want to ask you today, we're talking about the spiritual side of mental health. Mm-hmm. And when it comes to the Christian faith, what do you think is different about how we approach our mental health? What do you think people miss in this area?
Yeah, well, again, I'll go back to, sort of one of your main taglines in the series, which I think is really important, is that, when we experience these things, it's an invitation to our spiritual life. It's an invitation to God to explore those existential questions, to look at the spiritual components of our overall well-being. At Covey Wellness Center, we have a really holistic approach in how we look at things. And so we're not just looking at cognitive only, right? We're looking at emotions. We're looking at body wisdom. We're looking at social connections. We're looking at spiritual things. These are all components of our holistic wellness. And if you haven't been asking spiritual questions, often a mental health crisis or a trauma will start that process. So it's really a way of honoring that. I think one thing for me that really reaffirms my faith is that I believe that everything that we're seeing science prove out in psychological experiments or neurobiology, and I'll give a couple examples of this, it's stuff God's already told us. So it just reminds me of, like, the design that we have in our systems, and that there's truth, and that God's words are healing for us, and that's not outside of psychology, right? And so an example of that would be neuroplasticity, right? So in the last, I think it's 20 years or whatever, all this development, the brain can change itself. It can create new synapses. It can heal. And for a long time, we thought, like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right?
Right.
There's no, once those connections were made, they can't be repaired. But the Bible told us that we can be transformed by the renewing of our minds.
Right.
So we already knew that we could heal those connections. Maybe we didn't totally understand it, but the neurobiology is just proving that wisdom to be true. And a similar thing would be, living in community. We've gone through a time of like a lot of isolation through COVID. And we see, some of us don't even realize how much the effects of being isolated and not being in the physical presence of others has impacted us. But our brains are wired for connection. Right? Like our brains function on oxygen and glucose and people. That's what we know. And so that's something that, God has designed for us. Like, we're not meant to be alone. We're meant to exist in community. God modeled being in community himself, right? God, the Trinity is a community. Like, there's so much that mirrors those truths in our spiritual world that for me, I just hear that and I go, yeah, because God did that. God made it that way. And now we understand it with this lens a little better, but it's true because God said it was true, because he created our brains to be able to heal, right? He created our bodies to be able to heal. He created us to live in community. So all the research around social support and connection is just reinforcing what he's told us is wise. And so I think that makes a difference as well. I think some people are sometimes afraid of psychotherapy, for example, in some Christian cultures, like they can be afraid of psychotherapy. And for me, it just reinforces my faith and bolsters it. And so I think that they work so beautifully together. And I really feel it's important for people to integrate those things and recognize how God can bring that wisdom together, for our benefit,
Mm-hmm. That's so great. So
and then we make meaning. That's it. We make meaning, right? Like we all have those existential questions, and that can cause a lot of angst. If people are hopeless or helpless, spirituality, if we begin to explore those questions and find answers for those questions, that meaning, that hope, that, the rescuing, even, the messaging of being the story that God's writing, like it puts us in the context, like in logotherapy, like Viktor Frankl's therapy, we need that sense of purpose beyond ourselves.
Right.
And the spiritual context allows us to explore that and connect with that in really meaningful ways. And so I think that's a huge component, the meaning-making component of therapy, that's sometimes difficult without a spiritual lens.
Right. Right. Yeah. The meaning-making, that, and Viktor Frankl, the whole idea of that purpose, purpose is what gets us through. Meaning is what gets us through at the end of the day. And I really appreciate you having this conversation and just the opportunity to talk about this. And I'm not an expert in this area. And so it's been a real privilege to have experts like you come in and join us. Covey Wellness Center is where you want to go if you're looking to connect with somebody who can walk alongside you and help you specifically. Covey Wellness Center has a podcast as well. And Sarah, just really appreciate your time, really appreciate you investing in our community. And I'm excited about all the people this is going to help.
Well, absolutely. And that's what we're here for, is to support. And I'm really glad to have partnerships with places like Connexus, where, for us, it's encouraging to us as therapists to see churches doing a good job of having these conversations and not putting it to the fringes, because we know that people are hurting. Right. And we want churches to have that humility and openness to start to learn about it, to talk about it, because people need it. Yeah. And we can work together. So this is just a great example of how we can collaborate, and we're thankful too. So we're here for you at Covey Wellness Center. If you're listening, please reach out. we have a fabulous team of wonderful, wonderful people, and we're here so that people can do just that.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.